Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Geraldine Brooks. Thank you so much for being here, Ms. Brooks.
Well, thank you for having me.
May I call you Geraldine?
Please.
We always like to get up close and personal. You're from Australia originally.
That's right, Teresa.
I detect a slight accent, and
Yeah.
you know, that's held me back, but you've got an accent and it seems to be serving you quite well. I love your accent.
I like to tell everybody it's a very deep South accent. That is deep.
That's right, because you live in Virginia now.
No, from Sydney.
Oh, okay, South Australia. There, okay,
Yeah.
I get it.
No, but we've actually moved to Massachusetts. So.
Oh, so you're in Massachusetts now, okay. But you lived in Virginia for a while, right?
I did for about 10 years.
You've lived in a lot of different places, actually, haven't you?
We've been gypsies.
You began your writing career as a nonfiction author.
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the skills you learned as a journalist that helped you become a better novelist?
I think the main thing is not to be too precious about writing. When you're a journalist, you got to write every day or you will get the sack. So you get used to putting it down even if it's not 100% the way you want it. And that's been a great tool for me as a fiction writer, because so long as you've got something, you can go back to it and you can fix it. But if you just sit there and wait for your aura to adjust itself, it's gonna take you a lot longer.
So you're not one of these writers who has 20-year writer's blocks.
I can't do that. I think having started writing novels with an infant in the house is very helpful, because you learn to write under almost any circumstances, with your baby crying and having to take breaks, to nurse and so forth. So for me, you just write. You don't worry about writer's blocks. The school bus comes and the kids get on it and I go to work.
But you have to be pretty driven to set up a writing schedule to accommodate all these family responsibilities, right?
Well, I think everybody juggles things, whatever your job is. I think in many ways I've got it much easier because I'm actually in the house when the kids come home from school. And whereas when you're working for a corporation or something like that, you're on somebody else's schedule.
Your first novel, Year of Wonders, was about the plague of 1666. O Magazine said it's a tale of hope in a time of despair. How tricky was it for you as a writer to maintain that balance between hope and despair?
I didn't kind of think of it that way. I was just trying to imagine myself into the heads of these villagers who, and it is based on a true story, they'd taken this unique decision to voluntarily quarantine themselves when plague struck the village, and every other place people just ran for it to save their own lives. But having taken this heroic self-sacrificing decision, then they were stuck there and they were kind of in the prison of their own making. And I guess just trying to think about what that would be like, what would be the horrors of it, watching your neighbors die around you, having to take on the burdens of whatever jobs they used to do, learning how to be a different person, but also what might be a positive kind of change that might come out of it. Might somebody really find a heroic side to themselves that they didn't even know was there? Because it's when you're tested by catastrophe that you find out who you really are.
Good point. Tell us about your character, Anna.
Well, she is the voice of the book. She's the narrator. And she was suggested to me by a half-line reference in one of the very few written documents from the period, which is a letter that the rector of Eam, had written after his wife died. And in it he makes reference to, fortunately my maid continued in health, which was a blessing. And I wondered who she was, and I wondered if I could find out anything about the real maid, but there wasn't a thing because people didn't pay any attention to the lives of domestic servants in those days. So I was free to invent her.
When you're writing a subject, about a subject that is a fairly dark subject, I mean the plague, how do you as a writer keep your perspective, would not get too overwhelmed by the darkness of it? Family's got to help.
Oh, yeah, yes and no, because in that this book, my character loses her 2 kids. And that was the hardest thing to write. You know, for a mother to write about the death of children is really quite brutal. And particularly because as I'd imagined Anna's sons, I imagined them very much as my own, and little things that I had noticed about them as babies and as toddlers. And I used all that in the book, as you have to. As a novelist, you use everything. But then when they had to die, it was doubly hard.
The book's dedicated to your husband, Tony Horwitz, who's a wonderful writer in his own right. And you say something in the inscription to the effect that without you, I couldn't have gone there. And I wonder if you might elaborate that on a little bit.
Well, it's true on a literal and a figurative plane, because I was actually with him walking in the Derbyshire countryside when we stumbled across the story of the plague village. He was on an assignment and I was just tagging along to get out in the country. But also he emboldened me to make the jump from nonfiction to fiction. And I was a little bit reluctant. I thought if I made the jump I might end up a wet splat on the pavement. But he said, you've got to try it, give it a go. And so I did.
Oh, and you got these wonderful, wonderful reviews. And then you've got your second novel, March, which is based on the absent father and Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. At what point did you know that you needed to tell more about Little Women, that story wasn't finished, and that there was a story for you to tell?
Well, I kind of came into that slantwise, if you like. We had come back from living overseas, and we were living in Virginia, and my husband grew up in the D.C. area, and he's always been a complete Civil War nutcase. He's obsessed with it. And so once we were back in Virginia, it was every weekend there was some other Civil War thing going on, and I was getting a little tired of it, to tell you the truth. But I thought, I have to find a way of connecting with this interest of his. And I found it in my own backyard, paradoxically. The people who had lived in our house before us had dug up a Union soldier's Civil War belt buckle. And I started to think about the young men of the village of that time, and I knew that Quakers had lived in our house. It was a predominantly Quaker town. And of course Quakers are pacifists, but they are also ardent abolitionists. And for some young men of the village there was a huge decision of conscience to be made, whether violence was the greater evil or slavery. And for those who said slavery was the greater evil, they took up arms and fought on the Union side, and it was the only town in Virginia that raised a unit that fought on the Union side during the war. And I started to think about those young men and the idealism that had impelled them to go to war, and that led me to thinking about that other famous idealist who goes to war, which is Mr. March in Little Women, and I wondered what happens to idealists when they go to war.
In your author notes, you say that you owe a little bit of credit to your mom, who told you when you first read the book to take it with a grain of salt.
Little Women, definitely. She said, read this, you'll love it. It's got great girl characters, but take it with a grain of salt, because no one on earth is such a goody-goody as that mommy.
In some ways, then, did you tell the story that Louisa May Alcott couldn't because of the constraints of her generation?
Well, she used to write under pen names, and when she wrote under pen names, the writing was nothing like Little Women. And
isn't that fascinating?
as famous and successful as that book made her, and it really was like the Twilight series of her day. I mean, massive bestseller. She became a very wealthy, celebrated woman. She didn't have a lot of time for the book, and she writes in her journal that it was something that her publishers forced on her. And she says, my publisher wants a book for girls. I've never liked girls much. And I was astonished. So yeah, when she wrote under pen names, and some of them were male pen names, she would tackle very dark adult themes. So I hope if she's up there looking down, she didn't mind that I took some liberties in the spaces that she'd left in her novel.
You tell the story from March's point of view as a first-person narrator. How did you capture the tone of the Civil War era?
Well, I used Louisa May Alcott's own father, Bronson Alcott, to draw a character for Mr. March in the same way that she used herself and her sisters in drawing the Little Women. And Bronson Alcott was a fantastically interesting man. He was a radical. He was an ardent educational reformer, women's rights activist, abolitionist, animal rights activist. He not only wouldn't eat meat, he didn't think we should use wool because it was the rightful property of the sheep. So anyway, he was really out there, and he was also very influential in his effect on Thoreau and Emerson, who were his neighbors in Concord, Massachusetts. So he was there was a lot to draw from in creating this idealistic chaplain who goes off to be a minister during the Civil War. And I read widely in Bronson's journals and other journals of the time just to get that beautiful cadence that they had, because they really were very rich in their use of language and very flowery in the way they expressed themselves. So it was fun to try and be a bit of a ventriloquist of that voice.
Well, you even write dialogue for Thoreau and Emerson. How heady is that?
That was fun. And actually some of it is their own words, not in, I've changed the context, but I've used their own words as often as I could.
You mentioned earlier taking liberties. When you're telling a story that was originally generated by another author that's bound by history, what sort of departures can you take?
So it's the same with most of my books, in that they are always inspired by actual incidents in history. And what I look for is a story where you can know something but you can't know everything. It's no good for me if there are masses of journals and diaries that tell you exactly what happened and what everybody was thinking. I like to find the stories where there are some mysteries, where the historical record falls silent. And those are the voids, I think, where it's okay to let imagination work. I try and keep it plausible up to a point, but I also think it should be fun. So sometimes you, as a novelist, get to make things come out the way you wished they would, when you know that there's not a snowballs in hell that they actually would have.
Well, see, that's what I'm hoping. I hope you'll write a sequel where Beth comes back to life. I mean, that's what we're missing. You talk about knowing some things and not knowing some things. What did you know about March from reading the book, and what did you not know? What about him puzzled you?
She doesn't give us much. Louisa May Alcott, I think because she wants to keep the focus so tightly on the girls. In a Victorian family like that, if the dad was there, he would be running the show. So to liberate them from that, she has to get him out of the house. And so from the very first page of Little Women, we're told that he's away down south where the fighting was. But we don't hear much about what's going on with him because the focus is very domestic. So we know that he gets sick because Mommy is summoned urgently to his bedside, but we never told what he's sick with or how he got sick. And then he staggers home. And that's at the end of the book as it was originally published. And all we hear from him is his opinion of how each of the girls has been changed in the year that he was away. But what happened to him and how war changed him, Louisa May is totally silent on that.
And so what were you particularly curious about when it came to his character? What did you wonder about? I wondered about how he could leave home, you know, and leave his wife with all the responsibilities.
Yeah, but, you know, people who feel driven to serve do that even today. You know, a lot of military families make huge sacrifices every day. So that, to me, is not so puzzling. When you have a cause like abolition of slavery. So many people so moved to sacrifice for that cause. So it wasn't the going away that puzzled me so much. For me, it's more that if you go into war with a good heart and the highest of ideals, and yet you're asked to do things that are just dreadful in the course of that service, how do you live with it? And so that, to me, is the puzzle. What does war do to good people?
As mesmerizing a character as March is, I was equally intrigued by the character of Grace. At what point in the process did she come to you?
Oh, well, she came to me really early. The fascinating thing about Bronson Alcott's early life and because I was using him to create the March character. He was a peddler in the South when he was a young man. He was born and raised on a hardscrabble farm in Connecticut, and he went south peddling what they called Yankee notions, which was anything that people might need, like from needle and thread to eyeglasses to books. And he just carried these trunks and he was so impressed by these great southern planters' houses along the Charles and James rivers. And he writes in his journal, and there's a kind of a moral blindness towards slavery, that he doesn't see that this lovely leisured life of the mind that he is admiring is on the backs of, you know, people who are enslaved. So I thought that my character would have to have some encounter or some experience that would open his eyes. And I don't know what really happened with Bronson to turn him from this kind of dazzled young man into the ardent abolitionist that he became in later life. But he did. Bronson actually put himself in the line of fire to protest the repatriation of a runaway slave in Massachusetts. But it's not clear what made the switch in him, so I had to contrive some reason why this young man would change his views. And I thought that a relationship with an enslaved person that would open his eyes to the brutalities of the system would be one way to go about it.
Is Grace based on anybody?
She's not based on anybody, but her voice borrows heavily from a remarkable memoir called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself, by Harriet Ann Jacobs. We don't have a lot of written first-person accounts by enslaved people because it was actually against the law to teach a slave to write for many, many years. So slaves were kept illiterate. So the pickings are pretty slim when you're trying to hear voices of these people and recreate them in a convincing way. So it was wonderful to find Harriet Ann Jacobs' narrative, and there's a kind of a clarity and understanding of the barbarities of the system that she was enmeshed in. At the same time, there's a complete absence of self-pity and a very graceful tone in the writing, and so that was what inspired the voice of Grace for me.
Do you feel a special kinship with Louisa May Alcott now that you've written this book?
Yeah, I do. Well, she's such a fascinating character, and I think she's been underappreciated because she really was quite a radical woman in her own right. She was very much an ardent proponent of women's right to vote, and just her wonderful unwillingness to take herself too seriously and to be overwhelmed by her own fame. She stayed very grounded and terrific person.
Isn't it wonderful the way that your novel has brought new attention to her career?
Well, I hope it has.
And isn't it wonderful that you won a Pulitzer Prize?
Yeah, well, that didn't suck.
Yeah, no. Did you know that was in the works, that was any possibility?
I had not
Really
the
not?
slightest idea. They're very secretive about that, and you don't even know if there's a short list or who's on it or anything, and it was beyond the wildest imaginings that I ever had.
How did you find out you'd won?
So I was playing hooky one day with my son. It was the beginning of his spring break, so I decided to not go to my office and just goof off with him. So I was goofing off with him. And a few seconds after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the phone rang. And it was an old friend of mine from my days as a reporter. And he thought I already knew, because they don't announce the prize so much as they just put it out on the newswire. And all the, of course, newsrooms are fascinated by who got it for reporting. So the newsrooms are focused. And he called and he said, "Oh, this is so great, you're so wonderful." And I thought, 3 o'clock, Ken's been out to a long lunch. And I had no idea what he was talking about. And he said, "You don't know you've won the Pulitzer Prize?" And I said, "Don't be so silly, I haven't done any journalism. How would I be winning the Pulitzer Prize?" And he said, "You got it for your novel."
Wow. And so then what happens? Do you go to a ceremony?
Then, you put the phone on, immediately rings again, and before you know it, there's a photographer at the door and people with flowers, and there was a lovely moment. My son, who was then 9, I was on the phone and he answered the door and they wanted me to sign for the flowers, and he said, "Mum can't come now. She's really busy. She just got the Pulitzer Prize."
Oh, that's a wonderful name for it, the Pulitzer Prize. Is it a physical prize, something you can put up on your mantle, or a medallion?
They give
or what?
you a certificate, which is actually on display at the library right now. And they give you a tiny little Tiffany glass paperweight.
What do you do with that? Where do you keep it?
I keep it on my windowsill and watch the light dance through it and feel pretty smug.
Well, you should. As exciting and thrilling as all of this is, getting the Pulitzer and having, have the light stream through it and all of that sort of thing, and all that, is it intimidating in any way? I'm just wondering, I know you were already working on your third novel, People of the Book, when you got the prize, but were you a little hesitant? Do you think, man, I don't know if I can reach that level again? Did that enter your thinking at all?
There's no good going on like that, really. I mean, well, good luck with that. I'm going to be more literary now. I've got the Pulitzer Prize. No, it's not going to work like that. I think you just do what you always do, which is go day by day and try and write the best, most true, most convincing work that you can. I don't think you can change yourself, and it's no good fretting on it.
That's what keeps you so healthy and steady as a writer. You actually got the idea for the book, the People of the Book, from your work as a journalist for the Wall Street Journal, I believe.
Yeah, I think all of my books, one way or another,
go back to that.
Come back to experience, or at least I'm always drawing on experiences I had during that decade or more as a foreign correspondent, because the experiences were so intense.
Oh, of course, covering a war in Bosnia. I mean, it doesn't get more intense than that. But how does an idea become a plot?
So I was in Sarajevo during the siege of the city, and there were rumors going around speculating about the fate of this marvelous 14th century Hebrew codex known as the Sarajevo Haggadah, and I became interested whether it had survived the war, and then it turned out that it had been rescued from destruction by a Muslim librarian who'd risked his life and gone in under shelling to bring the book to a safe hiding place. And I started to be intrigued that this little Hebrew book that had been created at a time of mutual tolerance in Spain when Christians and Muslims and Jews were living and working side by side. And that society had been torn apart, of course, by Ferdinand and Isabel's wars of reconquest, and then the driving out of Spain of Muslims and Jews. And yet the little book survived, and it went to Venice, and in Venice it was saved by a Catholic priest during the Pope's Inquisition, when other Hebrew books were consigned to the fire, and we don't know why he did that, but it's interesting. And then it got across the Adriatic and wound up in Sarajevo. And and there it was in World War II when the Nazis sacked Sarajevo, and a general, no less, came looking for the book, and once again a Muslim stepped in to save this treasure of Jewish culture. And I thought this little book has been through the same catastrophe over and over again, and now here we are in the Bosnian War, and once again forces of hatred of anybody who's not like you, the ultra-nationalists who were shelling this multicultural city, have arisen, and the book is in danger. But every time there are always a few people who see through the propaganda and who'll stand up and say, no, what unites us is more important than what divides us.
Now, it's interesting that all of your books, even though they're historical novels, have contemporary significance. You can really relate them to contemporary themes, don't you think so?
I guess. I haven't actually thought about it that way, but I think that you're right in that they all deal in one way or another with who are we as human beings when catastrophe strikes us. And I just think none of us quite know who we'll be until we're tested in that way. And the story that from recent times that I always think of is when the people were in the World Trade Center and there was a group that was trapped in an elevator. And it was the window cleaner, the guy with the squeegee, who wouldn't give up. And he used his squeegee to plow through the wall and got those people out to safety. Now, did he wake up that morning knowing he was a hero? Probably not. And maybe he might have gone through his whole life and never known he was a hero, but in that moment when he was tested, he found himself.
Do you think as you're writing these books that you're being tested in a way?
Oh, not quite so harshly,
Not,
thank
not
goodness.
so harshly, not so harshly, but you're bound to wonder, what would I do in those same sorts of circumstances?
Yeah, you do try and put yourself in other people's shoes. I think that you know, Pascal once said, we know truth through the heart, and in the end, you have to make a connection with other people's hearts. And it depends whether you think that human beings are more alike or more different. And some people say, oh, well, we can't say anything about what people were like in the past because they're completely different from us. But I don't believe that. I think the same things, the loves and the hatreds, the will to live and to save your children, I think those things are the same through time for human beings. And so you try and find the truths of the heart that you can use.
And you're still looking for the truths of the heart? Back in 1666, you've got a new project. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I'm working right now on a book called Caleb's Crossing, and it tells the story of the first Native American graduate of Harvard. And I learned about him quite by chance. I was looking at a map of Martha's Vineyard, where we now live, and on that island there is a significant Wampanoag Indian population. And this map showed sites that were of significance to them. And there was a notation on my town, Vineyard Haven, and it said birthplace of first Native American graduate of Harvard. I thought, how cool. I wonder if he still lives here. Maybe I can meet him. And then I found that he'd graduated in 1665. And I was so struck that he attained this amazing distinction that early in the history of Harvard College and the history of English settlement of the Americas, and I wondered what his story was.
Geraldine, it's been so wonderful having you here with us today. Congratulations on receiving the Helmrich Award from the library, and thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.